history.
In the last few lessons, we've looked at the earliest civilizations and we started finding out about the Egyptians using sources of evidence by asking questions and inferring ideas about them from what we could see from pictures, artifacts, and one version of their creation story. Today we're going to be placing the Egyptians into a chronological context, which means finding out where they existed on the timeline of history, which other civilizations were about at that time, and really starting to understand just how long these periods of history lasted. And we're going to be doing all of this with the help of a toilet roll. Stay tuned for more on that later, just don't stay clenched because, you know, that hurts. So the timeline of ancient Egypt is a long and complicated one, so you're going to need to listen and watch so that you understand it. So let's take a quick look at a timeline to see where they are on that timeline. So as you can see, the Egyptians existed for thousands of years alongside a lot of other people, including the 3 other civilizations that we looked at in the first session. But now let's look a little bit closer at Egypt itself, and then we'll start to scale this so you can see just how long these periods were using the toilet roll. So the history of ancient Egypt can be split generally into 2 ways, by using kingdoms as a measurement and then by dynasties. So let's explain these. Archaeologists and historians generally separate ancient Egypt into 3 kingdoms: the Old, the Middle and the New. So it's a bit like the Stone Age, where there was the Old Stone Age that lasted for a long time, the Middle Stone Age and then the New Stone Age. Within these 3 periods of Egyptian history, there were many kings and queens known as pharaohs, and they all did things in different ways over time. This history is also then broken down by dynasty. Now we've come across the word dynasty when looking at the Shang dynasty over in China. The word dynasty means the family who ruled. So when the king or queen, the pharaoh of Egypt, died, the next person in charge was somebody else in the family. A bit like the royal family in Britain at the minute. When the queen isn't the queen anymore, either she's died or she just kind of says, I don't want to do this anymore, it'll pass to her son or the next person in line, and we don't get to choose. Now, people lived in Egypt before the date that we are looking at of 3100 BC, meaning before Christ. But Egypt was divided into 2 parts, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. It was in 3100 BC that the 2 parts were brought together by the first pharaoh Menes, and he made the capital of Egypt Memphis. So this is why we're starting our timeline here, and this is when we had the first dynasty, the first family of pharaohs, and there was another dynasty that ruled after them in this part too. Then we enter into the Old Kingdom from 2686 BC to 2181 BC. Don't worry, you don't need to remember all of these dates. It's just to show you what was happening. We had 4 more dynasties, that's 4 more families in this part, and this was when the building of pyramids as burial chambers really took off as a symbol of power, wealth and strength. The next major part was the Middle Kingdom around 2125 BC, where quite a lot had changed because there were new dynasties, new families ruling over Egypt, and this included the way that pharaohs were buried. Lots of them chose to be buried in hidden tombs rather than huge pyramids because they were very expensive and very time consuming. We also saw that things like art and culture really grew in this part. Finally, we have the New Kingdom, where we see the first female pharaoh of Egypt. This is when Tutankhamun was born and Ramses II was born as well. And another change in burials, where lots of pharaohs were buried in one particular place, which is now known as the Valley of the Kings. There was a lot of stability in this part too, which meant that Egypt became quite rich and powerful. This particular timeline ends the Egyptians at 322 BC because this is when Alexander the Great took control of Egypt and brought his Greek influences to it. But of course there were still people living there, as they still do today. So this is my toilet roll timeline, and all it is just a toilet roll laid out on the floor. So let me explain some things. Each of the perforations, that means where the toilet roll tears off, is worth 200 years. So each bit of paper is worth 200 years. Now normally I'd only do 100 years, but I've only got so much room in the house. So we're starting our timeline off here, now. 2020, so that's just after the 2000 marker. Okay, and all the numbers in blue are the years AD, which means after Jesus was born, means Anno Domini in Latin, in the time of our Lord. So we're going to go back a long time, we're going to go back through time, and you're going to see once we've gone past the year 0, the numbers change to green, which means before Christ. There's no reason for using blue or green, they're just the pens that I had available. Okay, and you're going to see some of the civilizations and periods of history as we move along. And this is pretty much where my timeline ends, around 3600 BC, purely because I've run out of space. Now we know that people lived way before this, and that things like the Stone Age lasted for about 2 million years before this, okay? But we can see immediately here we've got ancient Egypt starting around about 3100 BC, which is where we are starting because that's when Upper and Lower Egypt were finally unified. So let's move this back along and see if we can find the end of ancient Egypt, well, where we are stopping it anyway. Aha, right, so now we've found the end of ancient Egypt, well, where we are stopping it. Okay, in 332 BC, when Alexander the Great took over and started bringing his Greek influence. Now, there's quite a lot of bits of paper there. So that tells us that ancient Egypt lasted for a really long time. Well, let's put that into context. Let's compare it with another period of time. So, if we have a look at Roman Britain, we can see the start of Roman Britain here, 43 AD, and the end of it here in 410 AD. Now that's just under 400 years. 400 years is a long time, it's longer than any of us will live. So when we start to compare that then with ancient Egypt, we can see that Roman Britain wasn't really a very long time. Let's compare it with a longer period of time. Right, well, let's have a look at the Iron Age in Britain. So here we can see the Iron Age in Britain started 800 BC and it ended in 43 AD. That's 843 years. So on our timeline, 843 years is this distance here. Well, that's still nothing compared to ancient Egypt. Let's go back and let's find ancient Egypt and we'll compare it again. So here's the start. Let's have a look at all of these bits of toilet paper that represent 200 years. And there we are. So we've had to move along a considerable amount to find the beginning and the end of ancient Egypt that we're going to be studying. So that just goes to show just how long ancient Egypt really lasted. So when we look at the Egyptians in the timeline, we can start to make comparisons about the length of time that they existed, their duration, and other people who existed at similar times. Now we know that people were living in Britain at the same time as the Egyptians in Egypt, but it becomes really interesting when we think about some of the advancements of each group of people who lived at similar times. The Egyptians managed to build huge pyramids and structures that had precision engineering and a clear purpose. Meanwhile, at a similar time, the Britons were building things like Stonehenge, which, although it's still very impressive to have moved massive 50-foot stones hundreds of miles without cranes and lorries, it's not quite the same as the enormous pyramids with complex networks and tunnels. The Egyptians also created their own writing system using hieroglyphics. The Britons didn't really start writing properly until the Romans brought it with them, and even then, not many Britons learned to read or write. So this starts to put things into context then, about the Egyptians and how advanced they were as a civilization. So what we want you to do is to look at the timeline and make at least 5 different comparisons between the ancient Egyptians and other civilizations that you've learnt about from the timeline. This could be comparing how long the periods lasted or stating when each period started compared to another one. It could be about different groups of people who existed at similar times to them and how advanced they were compared to the Egyptians. Or you could even compare when different periods ended and why that might be. So send your comparisons to your teachers so that they can see what you've done, and hopefully we'll see you for the next video.